Hello and welcome to our third lesson on Lenin's economic policies. Now we're going to pick up where we left off last lesson. So we had been looking at war communism. We're going to start today by thinking about why Lenin chose to abandon war communism. Now this was for a variety of reasons. Firstly, probably the biggest one, is the state of the Soviet economy by 1921. It was in absolute ruins. The transport system was on the point of total collapse. Factories couldn't get the materials they needed, and most industrial enterprises had ceased production. Grain production had fallen to disastrously low levels, and consequently, famine was sweeping Russia. The communist economy had proven to be an utter failure. Now, the result of this economic disaster was growing opposition to the Bolsheviks. Peasant opposition stemmed from the hated policy of grain requisitioning, which had resulted in millions of peasants dying from famine. The best example of this peasant opposition is probably the Tambov Rebellion, which you should know a little bit about from your learning last week. Workers also opposed the Bolsheviks due to the strict controls placed on workers' lives, for example, the introduction of the passport system. And they hated the Bolsheviks due to the horrendous conditions inside the cities under war communism. The cities were starving, and they were reliant for food upon the illegal black market trade of the bagmen and cigarette lighterism. Workers made their opposition to the Bolsheviks apparent through illegal strikes and demonstrations. They called for Soviets without communists. And the Bolsheviks only managed to maintain control of the cities by imposing martial law. It's really damning that the workers, who should have been the Bolsheviks' greatest allies, turned on them. And it just shows how desperate life had become for ordinary citizens during the Civil War. The Bolsheviks had also lost support of the armed forces. When the Kronstadt sailors mutinied in March 1921, it struck a great symbolic blow to the Bolsheviks. This garrison, in its strategic position in the Gulf of Finland close to Petrograd, had been the great supporters of the Bolsheviks in 1917 and had been key to their success in the October Revolution. The fact that they were turning on the Bolsheviks demonstrated just how disillusioned even the Bolshevik heartland was with the policies of war communism. The disaster of war communism also led to divisions within the Bolshevik Party itself. A group called the Workers' Opposition grew up and demanded that workers be given control of their own affairs, and they criticised the militarisation of the workplace, which had taken hold under Trotsky. Lenin accepted that in order for his regime to survive, some economic liberalisation would have to take place. They would have to abandon war communism because the amount of opposition it created. So you've heard my summary of why Lenin abandoned war communism, but could you now please read Corin and Fian, page 105 to 106, to learn a little bit more about this. Then use that information to complete this diagram. So now you've produced this summary of the 5 reasons that Lenin abandoned war communism. Let's go on to look at his third and final economic policy. This is called the New Economic Policy. I know, snazzy and inventive title indeed. The NEP was introduced in March 1921 and was essentially an ideological compromise Lenin agreed to in order to save the Bolshevik regime. It was seen by Bolshevik hardliners as a kind of tactical retreat. Make economic concessions so you don't have to make political ones. compromise and introduce capitalist elements back into the economy to ensure the survival of the Bolshevik regime. Lenin himself hated it. He called it a peasant Brest-Litovsk. He saw it as a necessary compromise for short-term survival. However, he only ever saw it as a short-term measure. Stabilise Russia under the NEP, then later on they could return to proper communism. So let's have a look at some of the key features of the NEP. Comparing them to war communism is helpful here so you can see the changes that have been introduced. Firstly, grain requisitioning was abolished and replaced with a tax in kind. Peasants had to give a fixed proportion of their grain to the state, but the amount they had to hand over was much less than that had been taken under grain requisitioning, and they could sell any surplus they had on the open market. The ban on private trade was removed, which meant that food and goods could flow more easily between the countryside and the towns. Privately owned shops were reopened. Rationing was abolished and people had to buy food and goods from their own income. The money economy was back. Small-scale businesses under private ownership were allowed to reopen and make a profit. This included businesses like small workshops and factories that made goods such as shoes, nails and clothes. Lenin realised that peasants would not sell their produce unless there were goods they wanted on sale. Finally, there was state control of heavy industry. The state kept control of the large-scale industries like coal, steel and oil. It also retained control of transport and the banking system. Industry was organised into trusts that had to buy materials and pay their workers from their own budgets. If they failed to manage their budgets efficiently, they could not expect the state to bail them out. Now complete your sheet entitled War Communism v NEP. You should be able to compare the two different policies and their basic key features. Next, I'd like you to turn to your textbook and pages 369 to 70. You should be able to answer all of these questions from those pages. Now we have a good understanding of the key features of the NEP. Let's think about how successful it was as an economic policy. Economically, Russia benefited hugely from the NEP. By returning the market, the NEP ensured the peasants had an incentive to produce more grain and sell that grain to the cities in exchange for industrial goods like shoes and nails. This meant food began to flow into the cities, helping to alleviate the horrendous conditions of urban Russia. Cafes, restaurants and small businesses reopened as the money system returned. Industrial production made a rapid recovery and factory output rose by almost 200%. As Russia returned to a capitalist market, it saw the return of capitalists, those focused on making a profit. These were called the NEP men. They travelled between cities and villages, buying and selling at a profit. They became very rich and were associated with corruption and extravagance, as they spent their newfound money on very conspicuous consumption, like lavish meals and clothing. There were some problems with the NEP. By 1923, so much food was flooding into the cities that the prices started to drop, while the price of industrial goods rose because they were still in short supply. Trotsky called this the scissor crisis. The imbalance was problematic because it made the peasants reluctant to supply food. But the crisis didn't last long. The government took action to bring industrial prices down and started to take the peasant tax in cash rather than in kind to encourage the peasants to sell their produce. Overall, the NEP stabilised Russia. By saving it economically, the Bolsheviks won back the support of the peasants and the workers And so the Bolsheviks were saved politically. Their regime would go on. Many people across the world did not believe that Russia would return to a more communist system, despite what Lenin said about the NEP being only a temporary measure. I'd like you now to complete this table looking at the political and economic consequences of the NEP. Finally, today I'd like you to think about how life has changed for the peasantry and for the workers between 1905 and 1924, and complete these two slides.